Hello and welcome to the OPA GCSE Sociology fourth lesson and the title for this one is What is the Sociological Legacy of Max Weber? So you've got a question here for your do now. It's describe what sociologists mean by the term bourgeoisie. So this is referring back to last lesson, okay, with Karl Marx's legacy. I just want you to give it a go. I'm not going to tell you a structure. I'm not going to tell you how to answer it. We're going to be going through that in class in the coming weeks and going through specific lessons for that. So what I'd like you to do is just to give it a go. Just spend 4 to 5 minutes answering it, and then I'll be able to give you feedback in the coming lessons. Okay, so just pause the video and think how you're going to answer that question and do so. Right, so moving on to the next bit. And the first task. What do we remember about social class? So remember, for Marx, our social class is based on whether we own the means of production. In other words, whether we own what is being produced or offered, and therefore the people who have the most money. So this is going to be a bit difficult because again, it's another activity in class where it's a practical. But just imagine there's lots of different students lining up, going from the lowest to the highest income. And they're trying to work out whether they own the means of production or not. So eventually the class have worked out who are the proletariat and who are the bourgeoisie, or at least to what they believe it is. The issue with this system, though, is it's a bit oversimplistic and it doesn't consider the complex nature of class. Like we said in the critique last lesson, it only really looks at the economic level. So we have things like teachers, for example, and nurses who are in the lower to the middle area and are part of the proletariat. And we have people high up like perhaps a second-hand car salesman. Now, you wouldn't necessarily associate a second-hand car salesman being higher in class than, or a dustbinman, than a teacher or nurse. But economically, they may well be. And this is something that sociologists have really picked up and really critiqued Marx for and tried to strive to go forward and best articulate class, because it's a very hard thing to try and stratify and measure. So before we go on to see what Weber has done with social class, we're just going to talk about and compare them a little bit. So both Marx and Weber are interested in the process of capitalism and social class. They both agree that the ownership and non-ownership of property is the main influence on class. However, now this is very key, Weber argues that class is more than just our economic position and should also include our skills as well as status. So the reason why you might have thought a teacher or perhaps a nurse was higher in status or higher in class than, say, the dustbin man or the second hand car salesman is because you might have been thinking about their status and not necessarily alone their economic situation. So their status might be higher because they're perceived as a profession, teachers and nurses in Britain. So they might harvest a higher status. They also might have perceived to have a higher skill set. And what I mean by that is that they might have gone or stayed in education a bit longer than, say, the second second-hand car salesman. So Weber's really trying to acknowledge in class, it's not just money, it's also how you're perceived and what you can do. So it's worth noting that down, that distinction. So Weber believed class was more fragmented than two classes. He viewed the status of an individual in a society as key to class, largely based on their job or skill set. Weber wanted to avoid the determinism of Marx and prove that some jobs with high status were low paid and many with high wages had a low status, as we've just distinguished there. So again, we went back as a class and we lined up, and they would have noticed in the cards that was given to them with their profession on it, some of them would have colours on them. So some of them would have green, some of them would have yellow. And if they did have one of those or both of those colours, what it represented was you having in your profession 3 or more years qualification if you were green, and yellow if society considered you a higher status in the past. And considering status and skills, as well as their income, so how much they were earning on year by year, they then had to go back and put themselves in a line again, but not based on proletariat and bourgeoisie, but based on whether they were working, middle or upper class. And what we saw was this shift. Many people were moving up the scale, some were moving down, because it was trying to consider more than just their financial situation. So we saw the teacher and the nurse move up slightly higher because of their higher status and skills, not because of their economic situation, but because they were considering class in a Weberian way. Okay, we also had some, for example, dustbin men and professions that didn't necessarily have high qualifications or were not perceived in the past as having a high status. We saw, even though they had a high income, we saw a lot of them drop down the line. So it's very interesting just to see how the class responded to that and actually acknowledge the complex nature of class. But Weber talks more than just about class. He talks about power and how we can define it. And he really talks about how power doesn't have to be this violent thing with someone forcing you physically to do something. It can actually be quite subtle and quite articulate. So Weber identifies 3 main types. So there's charismatic authority. So that might be a religious leader or a religious institution telling you how to live your life and what to do. So think like Christianity with the 10 Commandments and your priest telling you what to do. You've then got traditional authorities. So that might be in the past, think feudal systems, stuff like aristocracy, the monarchy, and things like that. And then the more modern perspective, really, you've got the legal and the bureaucratic authority. So that's those perhaps in government, those who are creating laws and saying what is a crime and what is not. Weber argued that this coercive power was often more impactful than physical power. So in his work, The Protestant Work Ethic, Weber gives an example of how the church, so charismatic authority, can work with the government to produce a really obedient, hardworking workforce. So for example, it might be that the Bible tells you that if you work hard in life, you'll be rewarded in the afterlife. And that it's good to be obedient and contribute to your society, and that benefits the capitalist system. Okay, it's making you passive to any of the hardships or inequalities of capitalism and your work. So moving back to social class and how Weber has influenced the measurement of that, we're going to look at a modern sociological study. So like Marx, Weber's main critique is that he doesn't consider other social inequalities. So we're just going to get that out of the way and acknowledge, that there are other things and there are critiques of Weber. However, Weber is largely praised for his contribution to class stratification. Weber's influenced modern or contemporary sociologists that are still around today, like Pierre Bourdieu and his cultural capitals, Mike Savage and Les Back. So Les Back in the 60s and 70s had sort of really the main class stratification that the British government used right up until, well, they still to some extent use it in census documents and things like that. And then Mike Savage. So Mike Savage is probably the most up-to-date sociologist in Britain that uses Weberian ideas. So during his time at York and Manchester University and LSE in London as well, he created with the BBC this great British class survey that broke class down into more than just 3 categories, but in fact broke it down into 7. So you can see the 7 here, and you can see the breakdown in British society. So we have the elite, the established middle class, technical middle class, new affluent workers, traditional working class, emergent service workers, and the precariat. And it very much took this Weberian and Bourdieu approach of considering lots of different capitals, so cultural, social, economic, body, lots of different capitals, and we're going to come on to those ideas later on. But essentially, all you need to know is considering things like people's taste, people's connections, their money and assets. It might also consider their skill sets, their status. So it's really not being deterministic. It's trying to be quite ambitious with how we measure class. And it was also ambitious with the sample size as well. It was quite a few. It was in its thousands, which is quite unheard of in sociology. So it was very representative and generalizable. So this is a breakdown of the different class system. If we looked in the past, so I use the example in class of myself. In the past, I might have been considered under Marx as part of the proletariat. In perhaps 50 years ago, if we were talking about a system of working, middle, upper class, I'd be somewhere between that working and middle class. But again, it's too simplistic. So what Savage was trying to do was trying to break down even further these different classes. And you just really need to acknowledge here what those different classes are and how complex Weber is being and considering in the past these different stratification measurements. So mine was in this Great British Class Survey. I've taken it a few times, and I always come up as the new affluent worker. So a young class group, which is socially and culturally active. So again, it's acknowledging, like we said in that line at the beginning of the lesson, my sort of a higher status and skill set, but not necessarily the highest economic levels. So what I'd like you to do, just to finish up on, is you might out of interest want to see where you would fit in this, what best describes your family. There is a Great British Class Survey that I think you can still do on Google and do it yourself. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there. This is the final lesson in the Founding Fathers, and I'm going to start talking about the actual modern theory. So the next lesson, so that'll be lesson 5, I believe, that's going to be talking about functionalist theory.